It's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a slightly
Yeah.
dated version with,
Right,
yeah, it
right.
had Taiwan in there and the different number. Anyway, that's
Right.
a longer story.
So, it's because people like you show up for this that, that change is able to be affected. So that was one of the first things I wanted to ask you, and I'll ask a couple questions and then we'll open it up to you in the audience. John, can you speak a little bit to the impact of films like this? I met you at the Explorers Club in New York, and you were there with Fatima and survivors, and they were speaking at the United Nations, they were speaking at the Explorers Club with you there, and on the Peace Boat, and then you kind of mentioned a very important festival, and the kind of supply chain issues around this. Can you speak to the impact of a film like this?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about the documentary world today, is that a big part of every good documentary is this follow-up campaign, because I think, or at least I hope, that a lot of you, now you've watched this film, you've had your jaw drop, and because you've been exposed to something you hadn't really thought about before, and your question is, what can I do? How can I help? How can I participate? How can I learn more, etc.? So, famously, people who make documentaries now say that, even by the time that you screen it for the first time at a festival, you've probably already reached a quarter of your audience by showing it to people at NGOs and in government and politics and things like that. So with this film, it premiered a year ago, Labor Day, and it's still out there. It's touring around the world. We just did the numbers this week. I think it's played at 90 festivals in 32 countries, and it was released theatrically in the United States in July and played in 21 cities and movie theaters. So it's out there. We kind of held back with it initially, keeping it offline, because I much prefer these kind of audiences, these kind of events where we can get people out to come and talk about this story and see who your neighbors are and answer your questions, etc., versus watching on your laptop in bed alone, which is okay. It's okay, but it's a different experience. So, having engaged in the documentary world and the festival world for quite a while, one of the great advancements over the last decade has been the welcoming of documentaries literally around the world.
Thank you so much. And Noelle, so you're doing this kind of work. Like what we're seeing with Fatima and her team, Mosaic Family Services here in Dallas is very much doing that work to support survivors. And there's that very beautiful quote that she has in the end about, in this world no one understands you or me, no one knows what it's like on these boats. And people really have, a struggle to comprehend the kind of trauma that these survivors have been through. It's kind of past most people's imagination. But she goes on from there to say that we can do this together. Can you speak to kind of what you do at Mosaic Family Services and how you and the North Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking empower survivors and kind of help to transform people, like you see with Penlin, becoming advocates to actually help rescue others?
I might jump in there briefly before Noelle, because I like to emphasize the fact that you don't have to travel halfway around the world to find these stories. These stories are in all of our backyards, which is why Noelle's work is so important.
And thank you again for the question and for everybody being here. I think to your point, when you say that we're working with this, I think what comes behind that is an awesome team. What makes this work and what helps survivors going through the situations is not one person, as said by Fatima, right? It's a collection of people who have been, a passion has been lightened, and now they want to move forward with it. So something that I really admire about Mosaic, and it's not just because I work there, is because the work that's being done there, it's comprehensive in its scope, and it's all fueled by the heart of the people who work there. One thing that Mosaic is able to do is attract and keep really talented and intelligent people who express their profession with a lot of heart and compassion. So whenever we do work with survivors, I think it's important to point that whenever we bring it back to the local the kind of paradigm, we have to kind of shift our thinking, because whenever we see persons who are going through this, such as in this film, there's an ocean between them and somebody who can help that person. right? There's force that they're being subjected to by the violence that the captains are doing. And when we see them here, a question that many survivors get is, why don't you just leave, right? And the reason is because force, fraud, and coercion is very real. And then when we take into consideration that though there is no physical ocean separating us from them, from the potential labor trafficking victim in our community, there are oceans being developed around them in the individual level. We look at that, the ocean of trauma, the ocean of language barriers, the ocean of culture barriers. But then when we pull back a little bit more, we see also the ocean that we as society and community members also develop, which is the ocean of stigma, the ocean of misrepresentation, the ocean of taking people out of context. And these things keep us apart and doesn't give us opportunity to engage with them, to understand and become more sensible to the vulnerabilities that they present, right? But when we change that, when we shift that perspective and we do diminish those oceans, starting with ourselves, we begin to form pathways for relationships, which is the key in seeking help for any of these persons, right? What in our experience was really helped, especially labor trafficking victims, come out of situations is a nosy neighbor. No, I'm just kidding, not a nosy neighbor, but a neighbor who cares, a neighbor who appreciates that person for who they are, right? We've all heard of microaggressions. What we could focus on instead is building micro connections. A little pat, a little hello. These things on a consistent basis will give us a space, or that person a space, to maybe connect with you and say, you know what, something's going on in my life, right? So it is those spaces that we have to bridge in order to be able to help with persons going on through here. And what I love about engaging with art and film such as this is that it allows us to put into practice that awesome saying of think globally and act locally, right? Though we can't go out and rescue these persons out in the ocean, if we act locally, we could look at trying to become a more conscious consumer, right? There's a cool app that you can find, it's called Comply Chain by the Department of Labor. That's one resource that you could use. But then also becoming involved in agencies or movements that are around this issue.
Yeah, we spoke about that app when we saw each other last night.
Yes.
Tell them again what the app is, because I think it's very cool.
So the app is called Comply Chain. It's by the Department of Labor. And what it does, you can look up any product that is produced in the world and see what percentages of that product is done by slave labor, child labor, trafficking, and so on.
It's related to the fact that just as impact campaigns are extremely important to accompany every documentary that comes out now, this notion of advising people or telling people or instructing people on what they can do is huge. And in this case, in regard to trying to identify fish that are caught by slaves, it's really hard. It's really hard. Most of the fish that these guys catch, and you can see the images of the massive amounts of fish in every species, just bycatch just dump onto the decks of these boats. They're not discriminatory, and they're not separating out the tuna steaks and the sea bass and the Patagonia toothfish, etc., to sell to you in a high-end restaurant. Most of this fish that these guys catch is ground up into fish meal, which then goes, a lot of it goes into pet food. You know, the world has an incredible demand for pet food. In the United States, the pet food industry is $30 billion a year. Walmart sells $10 billion of pet food a year. So what we advise you is less about ask your server where the tuna steak comes from, and more about, you know, pay attention to what the label is on the can of Meow Mix that you're buying, if you are buying that, and think about, you know, either continuing to shop with that retailer or maybe not. we've had really good success with this film. It's screened, as I said, in a bunch of places. We had screening at the Vatican, we had screening at the UN, but our most important, I think, most powerful screening is upcoming, and it's in Bentonville, Arkansas. Why Bentonville? Walmart, right. And to Walmart's credit, they understand this issue. They've looked deeply into the supply chain. They've spent millions of dollars trying to figure out how to change their own buying and shopping patterns, et cetera. But the film is a great reminder and a great little, burr under the saddle to remind them that, we're sharing this now with more and more people, and they have to get on board. They have to change. They have to evolve.
So we'll open it up to you all now. Anybody have questions? Jeremy over here.
Yeah, so we talked briefly before the film. First of all, I have to say, from a filmmaker standpoint, like it's so beautiful. The narrow depth of field that was used in some of the shots, the end with the reverse. I think that was really amazing. But on the content itself, I look at all of this, and this particular issue, it's near and dear to my heart. It has to do with definitely the destroying of the ecosystem. But more importantly, what happens to the people that are connected to it. And oftentimes, my first connection to a major fire was in 2011, after folks were talking to me. And I saw firsthand that non-discriminatory bycatch that was pulled off. So I look at that, and I look at ourselves. Like when I was a kid, they had this thing called DARE. It said, say no to drugs, right? Because we knew that all the bad things that were associated with people made them have to drugs. But I see that more today than anything with food and products that we eat. We can look at our labels and all those kinds of things, but at the end of the day, those things are still on the shelves. What can we do as a collective voice to come back and say, hey, you know what? We've had enough. It needs to be against the law. Something. I know that you're working on some kind of end use on it. But what is the thing we all can do as a collective voice? We need more consumers.
That's right. You need more Patimas out there kind of rescuing people one at a time, which is unique. It's a tricky one from an individual or consumer's perspective. If you want to wrangle your Walmart manager at your local store and encourage them to also be conscious of the supply chain, that's one avenue. I don't know. I mean, it's almost beyond the purview of the individual, except to be aware, and just pay attention. The MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, now has done a really good job of educating us, so that when we go into a supermarket and we see the fish for sale on ice, etc., they're usually in most of the grocery stores we shop in anymore, there are labels that says where that fish comes from. Was it wild caught? Was it farmed? Was it, et cetera? But we're not yet, and I've had these conversations with the people who run that labeling system. There's not yet a was this fish caught by a slave option. Not yet. But as you know, Jeremy, I mean, it's so much about education and just getting people to be aware of. And every time you buy a product, think about where it comes from and how you can do better. And because consumers have the reins on this thing. If all of us were to rise up and just stop buying, I mean, just one example, just stop buying pet food from Walmart, they would be kowtowed. So, and there is that option. But I love that notion of supporting Fatima. She's a unique person. I have a long career experience of dealing with lots of these people who I identify as these accidental environmentalists, and she is the queen. And if you've met her, you have met her, and she has just this incredible aura. She's